Hello, I'm Sue Pritchard. I'm the Chief Exec of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. I don't know about you, but I've been finding the discussions over trade policy, now that we've left the European Union, getting pretty intense of late. It's so easy to get caught up in the technical details or in the populist slogans, but what are the critical issues we need to consider? What really matters to us in the UK now as we start to develop new trading relationships with the world? Welcome to Trade Unwrapped, a series of conversations brought to you by the Food Farming and Countryside Commission and Chatham House. There's lots of questions to be asked. What standards, what values we want to maintain and raise, how we want to stand out, what we want to stand for on the world stage. Over the next few weeks, we'll be publishing discussion papers and sharing conversations from people with different perspectives on trade topics and how trade impacts every aspect of our lives. To kick us off, we have a conversation between two titans, Sir Ian Cheshire and Professor Tim Benton. So Tim, Ian, over to you.
Today, I am talking to Sir Ian Cheshire, Chair of the Food and Farming Countryside Commission, about why we are both interested in pulling this series together. So, Sir Ian, perhaps if we can start off with, what do you think are the good points about trade?
Well, trade, I think, does three big important things, which is it makes countries, I think, richer if it is well regulated and well organised, because countries have different capabilities, can produce different things, and then can exchange it, rather than one country having to do everything and potentially do it badly. And we've got lots of examples of that from actually our fisheries businesses, mostly exported, our hill farmers, most of the sheep goes. And if we didn't have access to world markets, all of our other products would have fairly tiny markets and couldn't develop businesses. So there's no doubt bigger markets for the world, more specialization of countries. It ultimately should create economic well-being. I think the second part of it is that it also provides greater choice for customers and citizens at home. You know, I don't think we're going to be growing that many bananas anytime soon. It's quite important that if we want to have them, they come from somewhere. And importantly, I think trade is often forgotten as a way of helping developing countries grow income and become more prosperous by allowing them access to markets around the world in ways that we can positively encourage to allow more people to escape from poverty. So I think there are many other reasons, but three big reasons why trade matters and can be a force for good.
So you say it can be a force for good, and you say if managed well. What are the risks associated with trade from your perspective?
I've seen, I mean, in various things I've been involved with, businesses and otherwise, I've also seen two main risks from poorly managed trade, or if you like, lack of quality control. I think it's particularly quality control. The first is that you get countries who do not basically fully price in all the costs and pollution and externalities of what they produce. And so you can just produce a commodity or a foodstuff unsustainably, cause damage to the environment, and then it becomes so cheap that it's allowed through on a trade deal, which encourages yet further degradation. So I think you do have to think very hard about that sort of quality control. And secondly, I think there are cases where you just wouldn't want certain products traded. I take the most example being illegal deforestation. You know, it's a classic example saying, well, would you want timber in your country if you knew it was felled illegally? And it wasn't that long ago that EU actually banned illegal timber imports, and at that point it wasn't there. Now there's quite a lot of evidence that there's a lot of illegal timber going to China. So you know that open door on trade of the wrong type creates ripple effects all the way through. So I think we have some choices about trade, the type of trade we want, the type of messages we want to send, and also an understanding that although we're not as big as the US, we have an impact in other parts of the world. We have a footprint that we create by what we consume here, and we should take responsibility for that.
And I think from my perspective, as well as the externalities and the quality issues that you mentioned, there are a couple of other things which we have to think about. One is that demand is not a fixed thing according to income or the number of people. Demand is created by supply. And if we create a globally competitive race to the bottom on a finite planet, then we're stimulating people to use their money to buy more and more and more. And you get the growth of things like fast fashion and fast food, which can become detrimental to people. And then perhaps the other thing that springs to mind from a perspective of what we're living through at the moment with COVID is the relationship between resilience and trade. So in a stable world, growing what we're really good at growing, or producing what we're really good at producing, exporting it, making money, and then buying in the things we're not so good at producing makes sense. But in a world that's increasingly unstable, if we offshore important things like our food security and something goes wrong, then that's quite a big risk to our resilience. So there's probably a proper balance between what we do at home and what we trade, and it's something that we need to think through, I think.
Absolutely, and I'd say that the resilience, I mean, the world for probably 30 years has been optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. I think the crisis has shown us in things like local food supply chains that actually, if you have more redundancy and resilience built in, you have a better outcome. And I think to some extent, we are seeing the things that we have valued have been prioritized, and actually this is a chance to rethink that. But local, there is definitely a local versus national and local versus international sort of trade-off to make. And what's great about these sorts of conversations on trade is people have to look at the whole system to understand what we're dealing with.
So from a kind of timeliness perspective, obviously the moment we're in is very important from a developing new trade relationships perspective, but also in terms of our local agricultural policy, because obviously one of the big ways that people will be affected is if our trade policies end up causing our farmers to have to respond in a way that looks like it's detrimental to the countryside. What are your views on how that balance between domestic and international policy interact with each other?
Well, I think there's this really interesting link, which often isn't developed enough, which is it's not necessarily trade per se, it's the link between subsidy arrangements and then they're transmitted via trade and have an impact somewhere else. So if you have, unsustainable subsidies for, say, fossil fuel, or unsustainable subsidies for certain types of food production which crash prices, if it was left to its own devices, it was in one country, that's a sort of decision for a sovereign country, you could argue. But by having trade agreements that allow products to flow freely, you create secondary impacts. And I think that's where you've seen things like cotton pricing, decisions in the US, crashing livelihoods in Africa. I'm pretty sure that wasn't the intention of the subsidies in Africa, but the subsidy plus trade transmits that. And I think that's particularly true. UK farming faces a real challenge if it moves, as I think it will, to a replacement for subsidies that were production are now going to be more environmental. If it simultaneously is opened up to price competition from people who are not being asked to make the same standards, and therefore the pricing gap is just too big because you can't equate the costs. So I think what we have to keep looking at is not just is trade good or bad, but is what are the subsidy regimes that the trade is attached to? And therefore, how do we want to understand it? Because we need to get that end-to-end impact.
Yeah, and I guess also as important as subsidies is the standards by which people produce. Because if they have to abide by local standards, which means their goods are expensive, and then a country imports things that are made more cheaply because they're not abiding by standards, and then you end up with the same impacts. So yeah, it's obviously a timely moment because of the Ag Bill and because of the trade relationships and our discussion of standards and all the rest of things that comes with us leaving the European Union. Do you think from a citizen's perspective, there is enough discussion and understanding of these issues and the way that trade might impact upon people's lives and livelihoods?
Now, I think it's a really interesting question because actually, I think what we're beginning to see is that for 47 years, we've been inside one trade regime, which we haven't really driven ourselves. We've always been part of the EU, but it hasn't been there. So to some extent, this is a not a topic that people have engaged with over the years, because it's sort of not been, our job, in the same way that when some of us tried to argue for agricultural reform, you couldn't, because it was the EU. So arguably you can say, well, as a result of Brexit now, you have this choice, and potentially make some choices which weren't as evident as they were before, because we didn't maybe directly control them. So I think we're coming to this as a relatively underdeveloped topic for customers, because it just hasn't been on the agenda. It's been too far away. And I think also, so far, it's been seen through the lens of, it's all about having cheaper stuff, and some of the trade-offs with the quality and the type of things that we know customers are concerned about, particularly in agriculture and food. For the first time, these are going to be political decisions that the UK is going to take, and have to make some of these trade-offs very explicitly. So I think it's really important that we make clear to the citizens that they have a voice in this, which is really important, to choose what type of country standards we want, and therefore what type of trade arrangements we want, and that is potentially actually a real force for good, because we can help change things around the world. If we take responsibility for sustainable food, that's a great thing to have an impact on. And also a protector, it's a way of protecting some of our infrastructure, including farming, where if we don't get the regulation right, we will potentially end up damaging the quality of industries that we rely on. So this feels like a topic that was marginal for a very long time, and is now actually really important.
And presumably that's why the Food and Farming Countryside Commission is really interested in this topic area, and why you're wanting to host this series of Trade Unwrapped.
Absolutely. Yeah, we generally think this is a topic that has been in the shadows for a while, because it wasn't changed, that we weren't driving it. It's now front and center. And at the same point that I think people are increasingly aware of the value of the right type of food for our health, for our ecosystems, we need to take an integrated view of this. And so you can't have a conversation about food and farming in the countryside without having a conversation about trade. And that's a new phenomenon.
And how do you think is the best way to bring citizens' voices into this conversation? And as a follow-up, will government listen? Because traditionally, trade negotiations have been highly secret, done behind closed doors by teams of nerdy trade experts. So how are we going to break that open so that there is a citizen's voice in this?
Well, I think one of the things we've learned from the Commission is to get out in amongst the citizens and actually ask them, because actually it's not like people don't have points of view, but we need to maybe develop some sort of early thoughts and straw men to say, look, here are some of the choice areas that we've got. So we don't have to figure out how to regulate the transmission maybe of a silicon chip through a supply chain into a computer, but there are some topics and areas, and I would say food is absolutely typically one of them, where we want to help present a set of choices to citizens, and then engage in a real conversation with them up and down the country in various places, as we have done with the Commission on some of the choices we face on how we use our land, for example. I think then if we have a position which is that there won't be all these things will be equally important, some will be much more important to citizens than others. And I think I would argue that if we can be clear with the citizens about where the really big issues, what are the 4 or 5 really big things which people are worried about and want to look after, we will see the same effect that we saw when there was a debate around forestry in the UK, which there was going to be one government policy, and then the public basically said, hold on a minute, I want to protect my forest, and we had a big shift. And politicians, generally want to be elected and know what people want. So if we could help organise that debate, as we've seen on climate and other things, we can develop a list of 4 or 5 areas where it really matters to the voter, to the citizen. And those are the topics, rather than try and solve all 1,000 technical trade points, as you mentioned. That's where the political energy needs to be focused. And I think we need to develop that list with the citizens of the country.
I'm really pleased that you talk about citizens. One of my bugbears is that people who eat food are called consumers in many of these debates. And actually, when you go into a supermarket, it sometimes feels you've got overwhelming choice, but it's almost impossible to buy things that are consistent with your values that you might hold as a person, as a citizen, simply because the transparency is not there. So I can quite possibly buy things which are counter to my values as a citizen, simply because the act of consumption, the act of purchasing is so lacking transparency. So I agree with you fully that we need to get citizens' voices to understand our attitudes, people's attitudes to food, to health, to the environment, to climate change, and to everything else, and not just price and taste, which is what you typically get in some of the conversations around food.
No, completely right.
Any other points that you'd like to raise, Sir Ian?
Well, I think there's maybe just sort of one other thought on the importance of trade, which is going back to what I said about our footprint, is if you combine the fact that in some of these commodities, you know, we are touching big parts of the world that we don't see when we're down at the supermarket, and we're also potentially spending quite a lot of money on international aid and development. I would sort of hope that we wouldn't just have a defensive trade idea of we've got to keep the famous chlorinated chicken out of the country. It's more what could we do to enhance for the people in developing countries incentives and support for them to develop sustainable food systems, so that nothing we do here is causing the Amazon to burn or forests to disappear in Indonesia. And I think it's a bit of real UK international leadership, and certainly, hopefully, with much delayed COP, this is something that actually is a classic place for Britain to play a sort of global role. And I think on the back of the citizen involvement, that has much more credibility and authenticity. So I think I'd hope that we could see this as playing a positive role rather than just sort of a NIMBY, we don't want this other stuff here.
So thank you very much for helping explain that trade is not just about the prices in the shops and our choices in the shops. It is much wider. It's about international development. It's about coping with climate change. It's about our health and well-being, and it's about the look of the countryside and the biodiversity that we see. So thank you everybody for joining us to watch our conversation. We hope that it's been useful and interesting, and that it will inspire you to get involved in this issue and help us tell the people making trade deals on our behalf what you really care about.